If a man stood in the last twilight hours of both Marilyn Monroe and Natalie Wood's lives, is that coincidence? Or a pattern that we've simply chosen to ignore? Warren Beatty has long been regarded as one of Hollywood's most enigmatic and dazzling figures. Actor, director, Oscar winner, and by his own reputation legendary lover. But behind the cinematic brilliance and decades of fame lies a much darker, more complicated legacy. One filled with broken promises, emotional casualties, and perhaps even the quiet kind of manipulation that fame often conceals behind charm and charisma. Welcome to Celeb Shadows TV, where we don't just tell you the headlines, we peel back the polished surface to reveal what's been deliberately left out of frame. If you're ready to see the other side of Hollywood's brightest lights, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment, because today's story, it's one most people still can't agree on. Warren Beatty was born not into glamour, but into quiet normalcy. Raised in Virginia by schoolteacher parents, he wasn't the child anyone predicted would set Hollywood on fire. It was his sister, Shirley MacLaine, who was the early performer in the family. Warren was the quiet one, the reader, the thinker. But something changed. Perhaps it was watching Shirley rise through Broadway and into Hollywood royalty that stirred something restless in him. Or maybe he simply realized early that fame could give him more than a stage, it could give him power. After leaving college and studying acting in New York under the revered Stella Adler, Beatty began carving out his own path. His early years included small TV roles, a surprising Tony nomination, and eventually, a screen test in Hollywood. He was just 22. But while the industry admired his talent, it was his off-screen behavior that would earn far more attention in the years to come. One of Beatty's first high-profile relationships was with British actress Joan Collins. She was older, already established, and completely unprepared for the whirlwind that was Warren Beatty. In her memoir, she would later admit that his sexual appetite was relentless. But more than that, she revealed a hidden truth. She had once been pregnant with his child and decided to terminate the pregnancy out of fear it would ruin her career. A decision made in the shadows, but whose echoes have followed them both for decades. It wouldn't be the only time Beatty's romantic entanglements would leave lasting consequences. Soon after, he starred alongside Natalie Wood in Splendor in the Grass. At the time, he was still involved with Collins. But that didn't stop whispers of an affair with Wood. Hollywood insiders claimed the two were practicing love scenes well beyond the set. Wood, already a married woman and under pressure in her career, began to spiral emotionally. Their relationship, though never fully confirmed, culminated in a painful separation, one that ended with Beatty disappearing for a full week without explanation. When he returned, Wood shut the door on him for good. But this wasn't just a breakup. According to those close to her, the emotional toll sent Wood into a deep depression. When Beatty approached her years later to star as Bonnie in his now iconic film Bonnie and Clyde, she refused, and later that same night, she attempted to take her own life. It was their last conversation. Wood wouldn't act again for 3 years. So what does this all say about Beatty? Was he just a man swept up in youth and passion? Or something else? Did he truly love these women, or were they simply drawn into the gravitational pull of his rising star, only to be discarded when he shifted orbit? What makes Beatty's story so unsettling isn't the volume of his affairs. It's the recurring pattern: intense infatuation, emotional chaos, abrupt exits, over and over again. Even as his career surged with Bonnie and Clyde, marking a bold new chapter both professionally and financially, his personal life followed the same script. He lived with singer Michelle Phillips, but withdrew public appearances with her out of fear of tabloid scrutiny. He promised marriage, even children. Yet when it ended, she would later spend years in therapy, questioning whether any of it had been real. Beatty wasn't just a lover. He was a producer, A gatekeeper. A decision-maker. He cast his current and former lovers in films together, blurring the line between art and real life. It was all performance-y and off-screen. And then there was 17-year-old Carrie Fisher, just starting her acting career when Beatty, nearly twice her age, allegedly made a pass at her during the filming of Shampoo. She turned him down. One of the few who ever did. Let that sink in. The man who would later be praised for stepping away from the spotlight to raise a family, who supported his transgender child with love and public respect, that same man also left a trail of emotionally wounded women, some of whom never recovered. How do we reconcile that? Is this redemption, or just retirement? And when does the line between charm and harm begin to blur? Stick with us, because the deeper we go, the more the light begins to flicker. So how does someone with such visible talent, undeniable magnetism, and critical acclaim still leave behind such a complicated legacy? After the seismic success of Bonnie and Clyde, Warren Beatty didn't slow down, doubled down. With fame came access. With power came control. And with both came a growing distance between the man the public saw and the reality unfolding behind closed doors. In the 1970s, Beatty's name was synonymous with Hollywood royalty. He moved in the same circles as Jack Nicholson and Dennis Hopper, not just as friends, but as part of a new class of artistic rebels, brilliant, unpredictable, indulgent. This was the post-studio era, when stars started producing their own films, choosing their projects, and rewriting the rulebook on celebrity. Beatty was right at the center, but so was his old habit of turning personal relationships into professional leverage. Take Julie Christie, for instance. Their romance was one of his longest, yet even it followed the familiar Beatty pattern. Intense chemistry, idealistic beginnings. But Julie, unlike many others, didn't get swept under. She had her own spotlight, her own voice, and still, the cracks formed. They had what we might today call an open relationship, but it wasn't freedom, it was survival. Beatty's wandering interests remained intact. He promised boundaries, but lived outside them. When it came time to film Shampoo, both were cast despite their recent breakup. The tension was palpable, but the production moved forward. Viewers marveled at the on-screen intimacy, not realizing they were watching something that had already fractured off-screen. And it wasn't just his romantic partners feeling the strain. Beatty's collaboration on Reds brought his other side into sharper focus. This wasn't just an acting Job was directing, producing, rewriting. Every word, every frame, bore his stamp. It won him his first and only Oscar. But ask the cast what it took to get there, and a very different picture emerges. Stories circulated of Beatty demanding up to 80 takes for a single scene. When one actress finally snapped at him in frustration, the crew applauded. There's a difference between perfectionism and tyranny, and Reds seemed to blur that line repeatedly. Even beyond the set, Beatty's political passion bordered on obsession. While shooting in Spain, he gave impromptu speeches to background extras, lectures about the working class, about justice, about labor rights. Admirable, perhaps, but the irony struck hard when those extras, inspired by his words, protested for higher wages and refused to return until their demands were met. Beatty, in a rare moment of humility, agreed, but the contradiction lingered. This duality of speaking justice while wielding unchecked power defined much of Beatty's public persona in the 1980s. He was brilliant. Yes. Revolutionary. Maybe. But was he ever truly accountable? It's worth asking. And then came the final actor, what many assumed would be. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Beatty's string of flings included names like Madonna, Daryl Hannah, and Stephanie Seymour. Fast, volatile, high profile. Headlines followed wherever he went, and his bachelor lifestyle became a brand unto itself. He was charming, unattached, endlessly pursued. But even that image started to age. The same behaviors that had once seemed enviable began to feel dated, out of sync, almost desperate. That's when Annette Bening entered the picture. She was cast to audition for Bugsy, Beatty's next big project. According to crew members, the moment Beatty saw her audition tape, he made a phone call that startled everyone. "She's incredible," he said. "I love her. I'm going to marry her." Most thought it was another line, another performance. But this time it was different. In 1992, Warren Beatty got married for the first time. They had 4 children. He stepped out of the limelight and into family life. To many, it was the ultimate redemption arc. The playboy tamed, the scandal maker gone domestic, the bad boy grown up. And maybe it was. But does that erasure of the past truly count as growth? Beatty's eldest child, Stephen Ira, came out as transgender in 2006. Beatty expressed his admiration publicly, calling Stephen his hero. It was a powerful moment, especially from a figure raised in the macho mythology of old Hollywood. Progressive, compassionate, evolved. But the internet doesn't forget. Neither do the women who once stood in the shadows of his rise. When revisiting Beatty's legacy, people often split into 2 camps. There are those who see him as a creative genius, misunderstood but ultimately noble. And then there are those who argue that charisma doesn't cancel consequence. That emotional damage, even when not criminal, leaves scars no less real. The uncomfortable truth is this: Beatty was never brought down by scandal. He was never canceled, never exposed by some tabloid sting. He simply aged out of the role of rogue, slipped into fatherhood, and took control of the narrative. And in an industry that thrives on reinvention, maybe that's the most dangerous power of all. Because when the cameras stop rolling, who's left to tell the story of the people who were never given a script? What remains when the man exits the frame, but his choices still ripple through the lives he left behind? In a time before accountability became a cultural currency, Warren Beatty played by rules that were never clearly written because they were never meant to protect anyone but the powerful. And yet, decades later, we're left wondering whether his behavior would have been received differently had it occurred today. Would his repeated entanglements with vulnerable women, many younger, many professionally beholden to him, be met with applause or outrage in the current climate? Would his romantic patterns still be labeled as charismatic? Or would they now be seen for what they arguably were, emotionally reckless, and at times, exploitative? Hollywood in the 60s and 70s had an unspoken code. Power excused behavior, fame sanitized damage, and men like Beatty, armed with talent and public admiration, navigated that world with impunity. There was no hashtag to spark a reckoning, no social media to challenge the narrative, only carefully planted magazine spreads and studio-controlled damage control. The real story was whatever they wanted it to be. And often, the people most affected by that illusion didn't get to tell theirs. Carrie Fisher, years after rejecting Beatty's advances as a teenager, would reflect on the incident with her usual wit, but even she admitted the imbalance felt undeniable. Joan Collins kept her abortion story hidden for decades. Natalie Wood's pain-her spiral into depression remains part of a tragic legacy still debated. These women were not footnotes to a man's success. They were its shadow. What's especially striking is how Beatty's personal relationships often mirrored his on-screen characters. Charming, magnetic, but ultimately untethered. In Shampoo, his character is a philandering hairdresser tangled in a mess of broken romances played with such ease that it was hard to separate fiction from fact. That role earned him critical acclaim, but also reinforced a cultural myth that men like this weren't just tolerable, they were desirable, misunderstood, romantic, even heroic in their emotional instability. But what happens when society begins to reframe that narrative? When we stop asking if he was just a product of his time and start asking who paid the price for his freedom? That's where legacy gets murky. Because while Beatty's career was undoubtedly groundbreaking, especially in terms of actors taking control behind the camera, it also ran parallel to a personal life that often blurred lines between affection and authority, chemistry and coercion. Not because there was legal wrongdoing in every case, but because emotional damage, when repeated and unacknowledged, becomes its own form of violation. The entertainment industry has always struggled with duality. We are taught to celebrate genius while looking the other way when genius wounds others. We make space for complicated men, especially if their complexity produces box office hits. But rarely do we ask who gets left behind in their pursuit of greatness. Even when Beatty stepped into fatherhood and domestic life, the narrative shifted not by apology, but by absence. He didn't issue statements. He didn't reflect publicly on past choices. He simply pivoted from center stage womanizer to quiet family man. And perhaps, for many, that was enough. But in this era of reevaluation, should silence really be the final word? This isn't about dragging down icons. It's about understanding the full architecture of their fame. Because the pedestal many are placed upon is often built from the invisible labor, pain, and silence of others. To this day, many admire Beatty for his artistic ambition, for producing Reds when studios doubted him, for playing Clyde Barrow with reckless brilliance, for mentoring young talent, launching careers. All of that can be true, but so can the other truths, the abandoned partners, the emotional ghosting, the convenient forgetfulness of how much harm charm can cause when left unchecked. There's no denying that Beatty evolved in the public eye. Supporting his transgender son was a powerful moment of humanity and grace. Few of his generation would have done the same. And for that, he earned genuine praise. But can one act of progress erase decades of patterns? That's not a question with a clean answer. And maybe that's the point. Because reckoning isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, it's about perspective. About putting stories side by side, not to cancel, but to complete the picture. Warren Beatty never lost a career to scandal. Never faced the kind of backlash others have in recent years. In part, because the allegations were rarely criminal, but also because they were seldom spoken. And when they were whispered, hidden in memoirs, glimpsed in anecdotes, brushed off as lore, not wound. But those echoes don't disappear. They accumulate. So when we look back at a man who once seemed invincible, maybe we also have to look at the silence that helped build his legacy. The silence of those who hurt, those who left, and those who never had the power to speak at all. And in that silence, what does it mean to call someone a legend? So where do we draw the line between myth and man? That question haunts the legacy of Warren Beatty, not because of one moment, one crime, or one scandal, but because of the accumulation of overlooked harm, reframed through the lens of charisma. We live in a culture that loves its rebels, especially the ones who wear their chaos like a crown, the ones who seem untamed, unpredictable, artistic. And for decades, Beatty played that role flawlessly. He wasn't just tolerated, he was celebrated. His behavior wasn't questioned, it was quoted. Headlines called him the Hollywood Casanova. Magazine profiles gushed over his irresistible appeal. And film critics marveled at how authentically he portrayed emotionally volatile men on screen. But how much of that authenticity came at the cost of someone else's real pain? That's the blind spot in the story. Because when charm becomes currency, consequences become negotiable. Let's be honest, Warren Beatty was far from the only man in Hollywood to wield power in ways that blurred boundaries. But what makes his case worth dissecting is precisely how successfully he maintained control over his own image. His reputation never truly cracked. Even the women who told their stories, Joan Collins, Carrie Fisher, Michelle Phillips, did so with hesitation, with wit, with distance. Few called them out directly. Most cloaked their pain in humor or nostalgia. And in doing so, they gave the myth even more room to breathe. But isn't that what society often demands of women tied to powerful men? To process their trauma privately, package it as elegance, and never make too much noise, especially if the man they were involved with is beloved. Natalie Wood's death remains one of the most disturbing Hollywood tragedies, shrouded in questions, theories, and uncomfortable proximity to men who claim to love her. Warren Beatty was not involved in her drowning, but he was part of the emotional erosion that preceded it. That's not a legal charge. It's a moral one, and it forces us to ask, how many stories of loss have been deflected by the glow of male brilliance? Even now, when Beatty appears in public, which is rare, is treated with the reverence reserved for elder statesmen of film. And in some ways, he deserves it. He changed the way actors negotiated power. He elevated independent production. He created characters that stuck with audiences for generations. But it's also true that he moved through personal relationships with a recklessness that wouldn't be shrugged off today. And that's what makes his legacy so uncomfortable. It's split. On one hand, you have the icon, the man who outwitted studios, courted danger in his scripts, defied typecasting. On the other, the man who left behind a pattern of instability and emotional residue that, in any other profession, might have triggered deeper scrutiny. It's tempting to say, but that was the time. But time doesn't erase impact. Time just gives it cover. And we have to ask, how did a man known for emotionally abandoning partners, for inserting himself into fragile situations, and for constantly choosing impulse over empathy, still end up being considered one of the good ones? The answer is layered and uncomfortable. Part of it is charisma. Part of it is artistry. But part of it is the deep-rooted social conditioning that allows certain men to be complicated while asking everyone else to be quiet. Beatty never positioned himself as a victim. He didn't need to. The system did that for him. He wasn't dragged through a public reckoning. He didn't have to face canceled premieres or online outrage, because the myth had already done its work. By the time society caught up with the need to reevaluate these kinds of stories, Beatty had already receded into the background gracefully, strategically, and with just enough distance to avoid confrontation. There's something almost cinematic about it. A man who spent his career mastering the edit, cutting, shaping, reframing, did the same with his public image. Except this time, the footage was real life. The co-stars were real women. The cost? Still being tallied. And maybe that's the haunting truth here. Not that Warren Beatty got away with something illegal, but that he got away with everything emotional. The apologies never came. The reflections were never written. The interviews never asked the harder questions. Why did no one press him on the Carrie Fisher story? Why did no one ask more deeply about Natalie Wood's emotional collapse? Why was the abortion Joan Collins spoke of not considered newsworthy until decades later? Because we decided collectively that it didn't matter. Because genius, when charming enough, gets grandfathered into forgiveness. And so, even now, Beatty's name sits untouched in the pantheon of greats. His faults viewed as footnotes, his impact unchallenged. But every pedestal casts a shadow, and inside that shadow, other lives took shape, some empowered by knowing him, others quietly dismantled by it. That's the complexity of legacy. And it's the part that never fits neatly into a highlight reel. That shadow we keep returning to. It doesn't just follow Warren Beatty. It follows every story we've allowed to go unspoken, every uncomfortable truth we've quietly agreed not to examine. And it speaks volumes about how we've been trained, generation after generation, to measure worth through selective memory. Because when we celebrate men like Beatty, we rarely do so with the full story in hand. We lift the legend, we preserve the image, and we compress everything else into a silent asterisk too complicated to address, too inconvenient to confront. That asterisk becomes the story women are expected to carry alone, not just in their memoirs, but in their bodies, their careers, their silences. It's not about putting Beatty on trial. It's about acknowledging the power of absence. In a world where fame grants influence far beyond a movie set, the emotional influence that someone like Beatty wielded was immense and largely undocumented. It didn't come with police reports or lawsuits. It came in the form of conversations never had, stories never finished, feelings never validated, the heartbreaks, the breakdowns, the private unraveling that sometimes trailed behind his departures like invisible confetti. And for decades, the script never changed. The genius is brilliant. The women are bitter. The man is complex. The woman is unstable. We praise his eccentricity and question her judgment. It's not just a double standard. It's a script passed down so many times we stop noticing the way it undermines everyone who isn't at the center of it. Even now, discussions about Beatty often take one of two paths, either admiration for his political boldness, or polite amusement at his romantic antics, as if the latter is somehow part of the charm. But should it be? Should it have ever been? It's telling that so many of his former partners seemed afraid not of him personally, but of being labeled difficult for speaking out. Carrie Fisher only told her story after decades, and even then wrapped it in self-deprecating humor. Joan Collins waited until Beatty was long out of her life before disclosing the abortion. Michelle Phillips gave interviews that hinted at disillusionment, but rarely crossed into direct confrontation. And Natalie Wood never got the chance. These weren't random flings. These were women with careers, with lives, with hopes tied if not always by Choicito Beatty's rising star. And for each of them, the price of proximity was different. Some lost parts of themselves. Others simply moved on, wounded but silent. Hollywood has always been obsessed with power, but rarely does it ask what it takes to maintain that power and who quietly holds the cost. Beatty's political outspokenness is often cited as part of his integrity. He backed liberal causes, fought against corporate control in film, and championed civil liberties. All commendable. But personal politics, the kind played out behind closed doors, carry weight too. Treating people with respect, following through on emotional commitments, recognizing the difference between spontaneity and selfishness. It's easy to be principled when the spotlight's on. It's harder when no one is watching. And in so many moments, no one was watching. It's easy to forget that Beatty's ascent happened at a time when a man's control over his story was absolute. He didn't need to be flawless. He just needed to be more compelling than his complications. And Beatty knew how to tell a compelling story, especially one where he was both the leading man and the misunderstood outsider. But there's an irony in that too. For someone so unwilling to share his private self in interviews, his real legacy may be the trail of personal moments he left others to explain. The script he wrote with his absence. The emotional editing he imposed on every narrative not about him, but shaped by him. And maybe that's what makes this so complex. This isn't about condemning. It's about complicating. It's about resisting the urge to wrap things up with neat titles like visionary or scoundrel. The truth lives in between. It lives in the tension, in the places where admiration and unease collide. Because Warren Beatty, like so many men in power, benefited from an ecosystem designed to celebrate greatness while quietly absorbing its damage. An industry that built altars to the gifted and closets for the inconvenient. And what we're left with now is the need not to tear the altar down but to look beneath it. To ask, what stories never got told because the world only wanted to hear his? To wonder, if we had heard them sooner? Would we have celebrated him differently? And to consider, what does it say about us that we waited this long to even ask? If we've learned anything from the story of Warren Beatty, it's that the spotlight can both illuminate and obscure. It reveals brilliance. Yes, but it can also cast long shadows. Shadows filled not with secrets, but with silence. And silence, especially when repeated and institutionalized, becomes a form of cultural storytelling all its own. Throughout Beatty's decades in the industry, we see the perfect case study of how charisma reshapes accountability, not by erasing the past, but by subtly altering its interpretation. He was never the villain, never the predator, just the passionate artist, the elusive bachelor, the misunderstood genius. He was complicated, we were told, and complexity, in men, is often considered a virtue. But when that same complexity causes real harm to real people, at what point do we stop accepting it as a byproduct of genius? We tend to romanticize the damage done by brilliant men, especially when it doesn't look like violence, but like intensity, like impulse, like inspiration. But emotional harm leaves marks too. It alters trajectories. It carves out invisible wounds. And most of the time, it does so without any of the consequences we associate with more visible forms of misconduct. That's the danger of aestheticizing chaos, of framing it as part of the brand. Because once it becomes part of the myth, it's no longer questioned as it's consumed. For years, Beatty's love life was treated like a fascinating subplot, not a red flag. His affairs were recounted in magazines, dramatized in gossip columns, even immortalized in film scripts. Women weren't seen as individuals, they were cast members in the extended universe of Warren Beatty, the persona. And while some may argue that many of these relationships were consensual and mutual, the power imbalance is undeniable. He had the fame, the influence, the access, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to leave cleanly while others stayed behind to explain. We can admire the work without silencing the stories. We can acknowledge the films, the innovation, the cultural imprint, and still ask who got left out of the frame. Because every era has its darlings, its geniuses, its rule breakers. But hindsight demands more than applause. It demands context. It asks what the cost was, and who paid it. And it's the intersection of legacy and accountability that Warren Beatty's story becomes something more than a Hollywood biography. It becomes a mirror not just for the entertainment industry, but for the rest of us, too. Why are we so slow to interrogate charm? Why do we forgive artistic men for emotional destruction they'd never get away with in other professions? Why do we still treat complexity in powerful men as a sign of depth, while expecting everyone around them to simplify, adjust, and absorb? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're cultural ones. And how we answer them says more about us than it does about Warren Beatty. Because while his story may be unique in detail, it is not rare in design. There are hundreds of men like him, some still on stages, others still directing sets, some sitting in boardrooms. What sets Beatty apart is how long the myth held, and how little it was questioned until now. This isn't a call for erasure. It's a call for expansion, of narrative, of memory, of what it means to truly understand legacy. Because legacy isn't just what someone created. It's also what they left behind. Unspoken. We often say that history is written by the victors. But in Hollywood, it's more accurate to say history is written by those with good lighting and great press agents. The rest, the outtakes, the closed-door conversations, the stories that never got optioned, those remain scattered across memoirs, diaries, whispered interviews, half told, half believed, half remembered. So perhaps, as viewers, as storytellers, as people trying to make sense of power and consequence, we owe it to ourselves to watch differently, to listen more carefully, To pause when a narrative seems too convenient, too curated, too shiny, and to ask, who isn't being shown? Who isn't being heard? Because if Warren Beatty taught us anything, it's that charisma can be both a gift and a disguise. And sometimes, the greatest performances happen off camera. It's not about canceling. It's not about idolizing. It's about asking better questions and being willing to hear the answers even when they complicate the story we thought we knew. And so, as we step back from the spotlight, one truth quietly lingers. Sometimes, the most dangerous myths are not the ones that scream, but the ones we silently agree to live with. Warren Beatty's story isn't just about one man, it's about the systems we normalize, the charm we confuse for character, and the damage we excuse in the name of greatness. Maybe it's not about tearing down the icons, but about finally looking past the poster and asking, what did it cost to keep the legend alive? Maybe the real reckoning isn't in the scandals we expose, but in the ones we still choose to ignore. As we close this journey, the question isn't whether Beatty was a monster or a misunderstood genius. That binary is too easy. The harder question, the one we rarely ask, is, what does it say about us? That we've loved stories like his for so long? Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this made you think, even just a little, then don't let this be the last truth you uncover. Subscribe to Celeb Shadows TV so you never miss the truths hidden in plain sight. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and above all, never stop asking, what lies beneath the glamour? See you soon.